Which conspiracy theory do you secretly believe? Story 1: recycling is a scam, at least in the US. Most plastics are produced and used by giant corporations in production and shipping and will never be seen by the public. Nothing I do is ever going to change that. The US isn't capable of handling recycling. Most of our recyclables used to go to China and now they just go to landfill. Most recyclables aren't actually recyclable. Most of the recycling propaganda you see today is actually paid for the biggest plastic producers. It's not even that most recyclables can be recycled, but rather the way we are told to recycle makes it impossible. You can't melt a bunch of different plastics together and expect the results to be usable. Bottles have to be grouped with the same kinds of bottles, etc. When I was a kid in Canada, I got to do a tour of a recycling center. Those jerks just dumped everything into pile, and it went straight into the conveyors. There's no point in even separating your plastics and papers, apparently. Story 2: I work in a public school, and I wholeheartedly believe that there's a conspiracy to ruin public education. I believe that underpaying teachers, chronic staff shortages, micromanaging, overemphasizing tests, gutting libraries, and many of the other ailments are by design and not by accident. So many kids these days are functionally illiterate and multiple grade levels behind where they should be academically and socio-emotionally. America's future is bleak. Story 3: all social media platforms have fake accounts or bot accounts created by themselves that comment basic, general, and polarizing statements to increase user retention in order to keep user engagement high so they can sell ads at a higher price. It's also a reason why they aren't in a hurry to ban these bot accounts from foreign political camps. It's an election year, so we will see a high spike in these users and comments. Their names, comments, behavior, and subbed content are almost always the same. Story 4: the super rich are actively pushing for and collectively planning for their own non-religious end time, where they think they will survive, but everything and most people suffer and die. This plan has them building their underground lairs, topping off their hidden stockpiles of supplies and weapons, and booby-trapped secret islands manned by a private army to watch the world burn down as they helped set it all on fire. And as resources deplete, they will continue to reap massive profit instead of helping to fix things. Story 5: the 1% bought our government and the political parties, got them to pass the Citizen United to legalize the buying of our representatives, and now are messing us to debt so that we will have to work for free to pay off our debt to them, even though we'll continue to owe more to them because nothing will be affordable. This is simply based off the fact that they are keeping wages low while increasing the prices of everything else, and they government hasn't done a damn thing except for pitting us against each other, forcing us to have babies while complaining about birth rates, wasting a lot of time and energy on trans people and other controversies that all only affect a very small percentage of the population when other things greatly affecting the majority, like the cost of living, housing, and basic necessities, are being ignored. Then they have the audacity to ask why the homeless situation and drug use is so bad. It's like, hello? When life screws you over to the point of homelessness, wouldn't you want to escape that? I would. Nobody wants to be homeless, and you can't get a job and magically be not homeless. In fact, you can't really get a job if you don't have a home or phone. You're truly screwed. Story 6: that the current disillusionment with Biden among young American non-conservatives is at least fanned by and maybe planned by Russian social media operations. The fact that you see more blame put on Biden while Netanyahu is almost completely absent from reports and social media posts about the war is just so strange. The fact that it's often intimately linked to the war in Ukraine in the social media narrative is just the cherry on top. It's funny how the Syrian civil war, which Russia is involved in, did not get mentioned to the same degree in relation to Ukraine. Story 7: there were many civilizations all over the world for 1,000 years before our supposed first civilization in the Indus Valley. I'm not saying crystal power or flying boats or anything, but the current theory of hunter-gatherer to urban planning with nothing in between doesn't hold water in my mind. I don't think there is any conspiracy about this. The discipline of archaeology is just a little over 100 years old. Only 3 generations of people. In the early days, the archaeologists went in with their expectations, cultural biases in full effect. Most archaeology was done in the Middle East to find sites mentioned in the Bible or other ancient literature, all very boring. Sites like Gobekli Tepe and the even older Karhan Tepe are very recent and really pushing the boundaries on our knowledge of how societies developed and how individualized it was for locations. Stay tuned. We are now in the golden age of archaeology, and armed with LiDAR and large data sets, things are going to get very cool. Story 8. It was common wisdom in the US in the 90s and early 2000s, at least in my neck of the woods, that you weren't ever supposed to flash your brights at someone with their headlights off at night as a way to say, hey, turn your lights on. The rumor was that gang members would intentionally drive around without their lights on, waiting for someone to flash them. They would then kill the persons who flashed them. It was apparently an initiation thing. and it always smelled like crap, especially in hindsight. The theory now is that it was just one of those chain email things that got out of hand. Just complete bullcrap that got picked up by too many people. However, I believe that this rumor was started and popularized by the police in order to cut down on people helping other people out, so that they could give out more tickets to drivers without lights on. Story 9. My conspiracy theory. The Florida government lied about the severity of Hurricane Ian in 2022 prior to it making landfall. I'd like to think they did so for good reason, but the end result is over 100 people died, who otherwise might have evacuated if they had known how bad the storm would be. In the lead up to the hurricane, it was on track to hit Tampa, which somehow miraculously always avoids hurricanes. People were warned early on to get out, and they did, mostly moving inland and north and south. The hurricane was projected to be a Category 3 at the time, but the day before it made landfall, it suddenly moved south. The projected severity also increased, but the government swore up and down that it would only be a Category 4. They told people to stay home and ride it out. Everyone knows Category 5 means complete destruction, but Category 4? Well, it might be rough, but you can live through that, right? 6 months later, post-storm analysis showed that it was a Category 5. Story 10, I have my own conspiracy theory, if that counts. This one is political, but hear me out. Political discourse has become quite polarized. I think we can agree, right? Well, a lot of the stuff you hear from both sides just seems so ridiculous and outlandish, almost as if it's satire of what each side picks on the other for. So my theory is both the left and right sides of the political aisle are full of fakes. Each side has planted people in opposition to make them look as bad as possible. Political party double agency. It's almost as if the left is behaving how the right imagines the left behaves, and vice versa. That is to say, Trump was actually pushed forwards by the Democrats as a babbling, insensitive buffoon that fits the image of the worst Republican that should be easy to beat in an election. Unfortunately for them, the Republicans push forward Biden, the political nothingburger that can't actually make decisions, get things done. Coincidentally, a common critique against liberals. So here we are watching an election where each side is trying their hardest to lose the election for the other. Story 11, Big Pharma is pushing medicine on the population to generate huge profits. The huge amount of people on daily chemicals is insane. We were not born into this world to medicate. There are other ways to cope with depression, anxiety, ADHD, without dumbing down neural responses with a quick fix pill. Yet everyone wants to feel better instantly and get back on their feet immediately. Big Pharma knows this and is happily taking full advantage. Story 12. The US faked the moon landing to prove they were superior to the USSR. Even when they were so obviously behind in the space race, the logistics of landing and relaunching from the moon are so mind-bogglingly improbable, coupled with when it was achieved, are so unbelievably coincidental. After seeing the picture of the lander recently, it looks like it was made out of tinfoil with huge gaps, and to compound the story, NASA lost all data from the landing, most likely to prevent it being scrutinized in the future. Story 13. The news on both sides of the aisle purposely stir up crime, inflation, race problems, and basically all the problems in the USA to get a reaction, fear, and engagement to where if you go to the reddest or the bluest city in America, and you just disconnect from what Fox and CNN told you, it's not that bad and definitely nowhere near what the news said it is. So many people would benefit from not watching TikTok news, not watching CNN, Fox, MSNBC, etc., Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, and step outside into the real world, put everything you read out of your mind, and see that it's not that frickin' terrible. Story 14. That the lack of American carriers and useful battleships in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th was not just luck. Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to attack. The Japanese peace delegations to Washington were painfully transparent, so much so it basically told Franklin D. Roosevelt that the Japanese were massing for war. Roosevelt secretly welcomed this because he'd wanted for over a year to get the U.S. into the war to help the U.K. He'd already been doing all he could to supplement the Allied war effort in Europe, sending massive supply convoys across the Atlantic. But he couldn't send weapons, officially, because there was no war declared. The aging battleships that were on Battleship Row in Pearl were expendable. Some dated all the way back to the White Fleet. We had far better new battleships, not only on the drawing board, but being built. Iowa was laid down in mid-1940, New Jersey that fall, Missouri and Wisconsin in January 1941. North Carolina and Washington had already been launched, as had South Dakota and Indiana. All of these greatly outclassed anything in Pearl that morning. So notice how Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, Lexington, Wasp, Ranger, Saratoga, North Carolina, Washington, South Dakota, and Indiana, all our most important warships, were elsewhere handy, very handy. Franklin D. Roosevelt knew it would take a real shock to break the US out of its post-World War I isolationism. Just having the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor wasn't enough. There had to be casualties, but he made sure they were acceptable casualties. Nothing in Pearl that day was essential to eventually beating the Japanese. Story 15. The Clintons have murdered dozens of former associates. I got a chance to meet the White House chef for the Clintons at a couple of corporate events for which he was hired to cook and tell us inside scoop stories. He obviously had intimate access to the Clinton family for 8 years. One day, a few years after I met him, he went for a hike and mysteriously fell off a cliff and died. I had heard the rumors before and thought them ridiculous, but that death just seemed very weird to me. So I sort of want to believe it now. Story 16. Terrorism is not organic, but is grown and cultivated and orchestrated by state governments against each other as another covert weaponized civilian tactic, that it appears and disappears when it's useful or not longer useful, unlike coups or espionage. However, terrorism affects the populace morale, not just in the target country, but countries globally, and can then be used politically to do extraordinary actions in response, often funneling huge amounts of political and intelligence cash into various theaters. Naturally, the areas most affected by terrorism end up being areas with natural resources or have some great strategic importance. Occasionally, there is blowback, but it is rare as it requires getting past the very intelligence services that allowed it to cultivate in the first place. Ultimately, order fills the vacuum of chaos, and the great filter occurs as intelligence services rule the planet with surveillance and monitoring. Those same governments end up holding far more power for next to nothing in investment, and having never really been threatened themselves. Not really a crazy conspiracy theory? Plenty of shows and movies play on this. Story 17. The Deep State. I am fully convinced democracy does not exist, and voting is fake. And every politician and government employee with actual power does not get elected, but is chosen by the puppet master, pulling the strings behind the screens. The military-industrial complex, billionaire lobbyists, big tech, big pharma, big bank, the three-letter agency, etc. I am convinced there exists no left-wing versus right-wing, not in the US nor in the EU. Both sides and all parties work for the same elites. There is no actual difference between a Trump or a Biden and the equivalents in the EU. They are controlled by the same people and organizations, if they themselves are aware of it. The real issues do not get discussed in public, nor are the real decisions made by the puppets we believe are our politicians. It is all just a giant theatrical play to keep the masses distracted and in control. We already live in basically a giant global Orwellian authoritarian nightmare regime that uses the world and its population as their playground. Divide and conquer. Story 18. Personally, the Mandela effect. I remember seeing Moonraker in theaters, yes, I'm old, when I was in middle school, and I also remember joking with my friends about Jaws' girlfriend. She had huge, ugly braces, and boys being boys, we compared girls in our class to this. She's got braces like Jaws' girlfriend. I remember these conversations pretty vividly, but apparently I'm crazy because none of those conversations happened. Because Dolly, the name of the Jaws' girlfriend, never had braces. Story 19. The Earth disaster. Every 6001, 2000 years, and so on, the Earth magnetic poles go through an excursion weakening the magnetosphere, causing migratory issues and more energy X-rays hitting all of us. Notice the red auroras further south? The Earth may get hit by a micronova in the 30s to 40s, and the Earth crust unlocks, making it tilt due to ice in Antarctica being heavy. They've found ice forest in levels there. Lightning will increase 10 to 20 times due to increased energy in the atmosphere, and ice age is just around the corner. And last but not least, we may lose global power, not just internet as they say, with a major X20 plus solar flare and CME, Reed-Carrington event. That would fry us today. No grid can handle that. Might be within 10 years. Will be induction power flow, not direct line of sight. Have fun. Story 20. Honestly, I'm one of those people that does feel like 9/11 was an inside job to an extent. There were just so many early warning signs that this attack was coming, and nothing was done to prevent it, even though it was entirely preventable. Plus, the owners of the World Trade Center literally opened a new insurance policy on the buildings days before the attack. After these attacks, Bush then had a blank check and nearly full support of the entire country to do whatever he wanted. And where did we end up? Ah, yes, chasing down non-existent WMDs in the country his dad was waging war in. I think the whole thing was just an elaborate setup, so Bush could go finish what his dad started, and nothing more. We knew exactly where bin Laden was. There was nothing stopping us from bombing him into the Stone Age day one. We had nearly the full support of the world to destroy this man, and we didn't do anything tangible with that support. Story 21. During the Battle of Britain, the RAF was under a lot of pressure from the Luftwaffe. The conspiracy theory is that the British High Command made the strategic decision to try and force the air war away from counterforce targets, military installations, airfields and factories, oil and ammunition depots, towards counterforce targets, civilian population centers. The reasoning was simple. If the RAF was weakened enough, they would lose air parity with the Germans and would then lack the ability to prevent the Luftwaffe from targeting British cities anyway, and potentially made invasion much easier. The British bombed residential areas of Berlin under the guise of a lost pilot to try and goad Hitler into ordering retaliation against British cities, giving the RAF some vital breathing space to recuperate and then gain the initiative in the air. In war, and when the wolf is at the door, tough decisions have to be made from time to time. Story 22. The Well of Souls dried up a long time ago. The overrun of squares, or NPCs, since the 2010 has been exponential due to overpopulation with 8 billion people. In this world, creating a lack of souls to go around more than they're retrieved and recycled after death, thus creating people with sentience, morals, values, goals, emotions, etc., but no soul. They just react to the world around them, rather than being proactive, especially with family and friends. Sure, it can no way be proven or disproven, but that's why I like it. Story 23. Here's one for you. AI is necessary for population control. We don't want to lose the work of the economy, but the PTB wants to lose the useless eater people, who are mainly people who sit behind a computer all day. Therefore, AI is being developed to eliminate only white-collar jobs, leaving most blue-collar jobs intact. AI is not coming for the poor, just the sort of rich. The rich contribute the most to climate change and environmental degradation to satisfy their consumerist habits. They have no intention to eliminate blue-collar, hands-on jobs because simply there aren't that many anymore. And if you adjust for how many blue-collar jobs are needed in service of the white-collar worker or office-building community, then you really don't need that many blue-collar workers either. So eliminate the majority of white-collar workers via AI, and eventually after the population decline that we are entering because the boomers will die and we aren't having many babies, we will be at a much more sustainable human population. We wouldn't even need the green revolution. But because we're down to, say, 3 to 5 billion people instead of 8 billion, and because office work, which sucks a lot of heating, cooling, energy, and electricity, is no longer needed, then green tech can actually service most of the economy's needs. Whatever is left that still needs gas, diesel, is not that much, and we don't risk running out for a very long. The pandemic demonstrated just how little office space is even needed anymore. And the next phase is eliminating the worker at the home office. Story 24. That big pharma is just as real as big oil and big tobacco. But that isn't really a conspiracy theory, since the Missouri case showed they lied about a recent vax, and courts have continued to note the same thing in reinstating state workers with back pay, namely that there was never any peer-reviewed standard study that showed it prevented transmission, and the other claims that it protected someone were dubious as well. Being vindicated on what half the country called a conspiracy was refreshing, although some still maintain their position despite the testimony and discovery in the Missouri case. Story 25. It's no secret, Earth is an intergalactic cattle farm. Our makers put us here to be consumed once the dominant life form reaches peak yield before population collapse, global war, pandemic, environmental failure, etc. That's why they shut down nuclear launch facilities. That's why they leak technology. There is a balance between population size and crop loss. We need to populate to the maximum amount we can so we can be harvested before there is mass die-off. There are some possibilities that don't necessarily mean we are food the same way we consume food for energy. We may inadvertently produce some kind of energy or force that we are unaware of simply by existing. For example, there is a self-healing concrete that contains bacteria. This bacteria eats the minerals that gather in the concrete. It excretes a form of calcium that fills up the cracks. We may be similar in a way we don't yet know. The people that control this world know this, and that is why they exhibit little to no care for regular people. They know there is a limited amount of time before our makers return to harvest, and they want to be comfortable before the end. But yeah, aliens definitely put us here, and they put us here for a reason, and it's probably not a fun one. I'm betting on food, though. Sleep well, everyone. Story 26. I secretly believe that a lot of the strongest proponents of environmentalism are just vying for power. I firmly believe in environmentalism, cleaning up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, making sure we're practicing sustainable practices, wildlife sanctuaries, and I believe it's definitely something humanity needs to be mindful of and continue to do better with. However, I also believe that a lot of the environmentalist elites are exactly that. Elites, just struggling for more power in yet another avenue. AOC's Green New Deal, for example, just reeks of power grab to me. It's kind of a catch-22 where I firmly believe environmentalism shouldn't be about control, but there needs to be something to keep humanity in check. Then again, if humanity didn't struggle with that little paradox of authority and power, then all of our problems would be solved anyway. Story 27. I had read a book on Danny Casolaro about a decade ago, and it seemed pretty interesting and suspiciously like it probably happened. Recently, Netflix released a doc on the same story, the octopus murders, and it's pretty far reaching in terms of who is involved. While it seems pretty unbelievable if I recall correctly, the premise is true. Basically, the idea of the octopus is that various federal crimes are being committed independently of one another, which are the tentacles. But when the octopus moves, all of the tentacles, which either is because everything is tied together or because everything seems like it's connected together. So what is the conspiracy? That the government has been watching us and the world since the 80s. At least that's part of it. Casolaro was declared to have taken his life when he was investigating the Promise program that was made for the government, who stiffed the company in slaw out of payment. But he most likely was murdered